in, oh, okay, recording in progress. Here in the Department of Geography, welcome everyone to here in Singapore this afternoon to this Department of Geography seminar. Henry doesn't need a long introduction. I'll just say a few words and then perhaps a few words about how we'll handle such a large seminar. So Henry is a distinguished professor here. We're happy to have him in the Department of Geography, but he's also co-director of the Global Production Networks Center here at NUS. I've known Henry a long time. I can remember our first meeting. I won't talk about it now, but he had a very big mobile phone. That was what, if you remember the event. Henry was then a graduate student at the University of Manchester in England, which was a cohort of extraordinary economic political geographers. I'd say political economy geographers, really, not just economic. There was a wider sense of economic geography belongs to the field of political economy. And his advisor there was Peter Dickin. But the moment that Henry was there was an extremely vibrant moment in economic geographies of that wave of globalization. And Henry was at the forefront of that work and continues to be so. Now, Henry, you'll have to correct me if I make some mistakes, because there's a very long list of publications and awards, and probably my numbers are out of date, but I think there are 6 monographs, Henry, not counting the new one, which is forthcoming in a few months' time, Interconnected Worlds, Global Electronics and Production Networks in East Asia, with a very prestigious press, a press that few geographers actually would aspire to publish in, Stanford University Press, a press known for political economy, but perhaps a bit less known for geography. Fair to say, Henry. But that's one of what will be 7 books. There's one textbook, but I think Henry would like me to say there are 3 editions of the textbook. And I guess some of the co-authors of the textbook are here today. There are 7 or 6 edited books. There's a Google Scholar citation count of over 20,000. It's frightening to look because it goes up. Like while you're watching it, it kind of goes up. So, you know, Henry is extraordinarily well-known and well-known for a breadth of work, actually. Some of you forget that he also contributes to methods and kind of theory and geography. So he's not just known for this range of work on production and economic geographies, but as somebody who's not afraid to think theoretically about the field of geography and to step outside of his area of specialism and to address the wider field. And I'm particularly grateful to Henry this semester for stepping in and teaching my Geog Thought class when I was taken ill. I think the students are grateful as well, from what I hear. So thank you, Henry. I should just add that Henry holds also a Distinguished Scholarship Award from the AAG. And I think, is it the Murchison Medal? The Murchison Award from the RGS IBG of London. So he holds awards, you know, from both sides of the Anglo-American Atlantic of human geography, where he's extremely well known. But of course, Henry is fantastically well known here in East Asia. And today's seminar is testimony to that. I think this is probably the best attended seminar that I can remember in our seminar series. So welcome everyone. I won't say very more. I'll pass over to Henry. His title, perhaps I think you're going to maybe share the screen, Henry, because the title is a little bit postmodern in its phrasing. It has the first word has brackets, so it's deglobalizing. Okay, he's changed the title slightly. So maybe you could speak to the title. Henry, you're going to speak for about 45 minutes. And then we will move into discussion Q&A. Because of the scale of today's seminar, I'll probably ask people to post Q just into the chat so that we can then kind of work down them, and perhaps post your question as well, because it may be difficult to field an audience of 200 people and to try and keep your questions short. Henry, can I pass over to you with many thanks, and we look forward to your seminar.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming, joining us. And it's a wonderful time to see many of you, even though we can't shake each other's hand, but it's great to at least see each other. So you will be on my right-hand side of a big panel on the right. So if I turn right, it's because I'm trying to look at faces rather than thumbnails when I talk. Right, so it's a great privilege to be giving this Department of Geography seminar. I can't even remember the last time I gave a department seminar. It was a long time ago. In fact, many of my own colleagues might have never heard from me in terms of a research presentation. So to my dear colleagues, thank you for joining this. And today is my job talk, so to speak. And then, of course, to many of you, friends, colleagues, former students, students of students, from Asia, worldwide, as well as a few of you from Europe, North America, bracing harsh time zone difference. Thank you for joining. I shall make sure that some of you at least are reasonably satisfied. I can't satisfy everybody, and hope I will be giving you some food for thought. Okay, I'm gonna switch on my timer so that I can time myself and remind James how much time I've got later on. I will speak for roughly about 45 minutes and shall try to keep to that. Okay, I've roughly about 45 slides, so let's see how it goes. All right, after actually a very long introduction, which will take up about 2/3, and then the other 1/3 will be on the key observations and the post-pandemic challenges, which includes public policy and research agenda. All right, before we begin, I just want to say that this seminar is based on quite a long period of time of work done with colleagues at the Global Production Networks and NUS Center. And my dear co-director, Neil Ko, is there joining us. So Neil and I, we co-established this center together with some of you, our dear co-founding members who are, So Yun is there, I think Aiden is there, Jung Sup is there, and a few others. We were lucky to be given almost 5 million from NUS to set up this center. So hopefully today's result gives a little bit of return of investment to NUS. And not long ago, in a few years back, I call it BC because it's before COVID. In 2019 BC, we actually did a industry talk whereby the head of Asia Equity of Hong Kong Bank in Hong Kong hosted a luncheon at Fullerton, Singapore, so that the four of us speak on the respective industries to about 30 plus analysts from investment houses and pension funds, before we then went on to see 5 senior vice presidents of Government Investment Corporation of Singapore to talk about results from our studies. So it's a great experience doing this body of work. Today's seminar is also based on some of the earlier work, the theoretical work that Neil and I have done together, published in 2015, that help us to set, if you like, the conceptual parameters. You will see how that fits into the wider literature. Then, of course, the monograph a year later, whereby I tried to think of how we can understand East Asian development through what's called the strategic coupling of domestic actors with global production networks, published with Peter Kassenstein's Cornell Studies in Political Economy. And today's talk will have a lot more empirical material from a forthcoming book with Martin Kenny's Innovation and Technology in the World Economy series, coming out in 3 months' time with Stanford. So basically, this is what I've been doing. So now let's begin. But before that, need a bit of a preamble. All right, something happened in the past 2-3 years, right? And we know something is terrible. And some colleagues here are from Hong Kong and China. Right now, you're having some difficult time. But today, we won't talk that much about COVID per se, but the other thing. The other thing is also a crisis. Not so much COVID, but to do with that little thing that President America is holding that comes out of the wafer, which in turn will be mounted to become a processor chip. So global chip shortages. Together with that, a whole range of dimensions, supply chain problems, inflation, trade wars, geopolitical wars that has just happened, decoupling initiatives, so on and so forth. And my broad argument is that the two crises are actually interrelated, although I won't go into COVID pandemic itself. What I'm going to do today is to show you a little bit more about how we can understand, if you like, the electronics world in terms of global production networks that help us to understand why different parts of the world are interconnected and what's next, or what can we think about next. Now, let me start with some examples. I'm an Apple fan since 30 plus years ago, the little Mac SE. So even Apple, right, the highest market capitalized company has problem facing chip supply on the right. This is middle last year, and this is just a few weeks ago in Nikkei Asia. On the other hand, even Mercedes, another premium product, right, that is telling you, this is in Singapore. I just visited, not that I'm buying one. Some of you know that I have a penchant for car starting with M, but not Mercedes, nor Mazda. And also M in the middle of a word also. If you look at the cheapest Mercedes in Singapore, it's only $188,000 Sing dollars, or 138 US dollar, cheapest. But it doesn't come with a communication module if you need to make emergency calls, and so on and so forth. You would have thought that, sure, that's the cheapest, B180, what's the big deal? Let's go for the new S-Class Mercedes, yay. Only 420,000 US dollars in Singapore. Sing dollars is $570,000. For that, you also do not have that important module. I'm afraid to report. If you meet a dangerous driver that used to be me, I'm sorry, you can't actually call emergency to help you. Meaning, even Mercedes suffer from global chip shortages, all right? Communication chips in this case. And you have seen many of these news about Ford, BMW. The latest is Toyota a few days ago announced 20% cut of production this year, again, due to, on the one hand, pandemic issue, on the other hand, chip supply issue, as the Intel CEO tells you when he opened up his Malaysia packaging plant recently. All right, so chip supply is not going to go away very shortly, at least until the end of next year. So if you're thinking of an iPhone or a car, think twice. Even my book suffer, right? If you buy from Sage website, you will see that due to global supply chain disruptions, books will be late. Yes, do a bit of marketing here. So the book will come out in June in my case, and it's quite cheap, $30 for 480 pages. So I suggest you pre-order early to avoid disappointment. I know, you wonder how come so many people joined today? Because I pay many of you off. All right, so what will happen after COVID, right? When the US actually is also pushing very, very hard to build greater resilience in chip supply chains. And of course, you have seen many of these kind of images, reports, whereby President Biden holding a big wafer. It's not edible, all right? But it's a big wafer on which there are probably a few hundred chips that can be cut out, if you like. So lately, he's been pushing for, of course, more chips. Yeah, the 52 billion chips for America Act. However, as you know, 52 billion can actually help American firms like this, Lay's, to make lots of chips. All right. So the moral of the story is, where does the 52 billion go and how does it go? I will come back to this towards the end. I know Neil may have some saliva dropping. You are the Crips man, so, but maybe Lay's is not your brand, so we shall see. Okay, so let's go something more serious. There are very significant inequalities in the world today. And that results in significant pushing back against what's called globalization, which in turn relate to anything from the trade war since mid-2018 to, of course, the more recent pandemic and the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so on and so forth. But what I'm trying to do today is to show you that at least in the economic sphere of this, oops, why is that drawing? All right, that is the global production networks that help us to understand as an underlying industrial organizational platform of the global economy. Okay. Okay, I don't know why there is a red line, maybe somebody invaded, but we shall see. Okay, so global production networks is the leading research area within economic geography and the wider social sciences. By the way, James, do you see the same red line as I see? James, there is some drawing here, is it?
Yes, there's a red line across the
I don't know why, but
across the screen.
yeah,
I wouldn't worry about it. It doesn't distract too much. In fact, it perhaps
okay.
enhances.
Maybe. Okay, I try one more
Who's
time.
invaded
Share,
Henry's slide? Says.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah. Please, no invasion metaphors.
So,
especially from Europe.
oh, true. As a political geographer, you're particularly sensitive to that. Yes. Okay, back to this. So I just want to say that GPN is a significant body of research work in economic geography and the broader social sciences, which help us to understand, if you like, the complex interactions, interdependencies of different places, regions in the global economy. Yeah, so it is a particular approach, if you like. In geography, it helps us to understand how things are interrelated at different geographical scales. But for today's purpose, I will only focus on the electronics industry, broadly conceived, all right? And to show you how GPNs are configured in the various subsegments, and that in turn together constitute what can be known as the interconnected worlds of production. Okay. Now, of course, there is a big body of work also related to GPN, and actually predicts GPN is known as global value chain research. So actually, if I think of the world of GVC and GPN research, we are very interconnected too. Some of you here are GVC scholars. So we are very close to each other, interrelated. And I think GPN works on GVC foundations laid earlier. Related to people like Gary Giraffe at Duke, Tim Sturgeon at MIT, John Humphrey at Sussex, and many others. A very prominent body of work, scholars ranging from development studies to economic sociology to, of course, later on, international political economy, international economics, regional studies, and more lately, international business studies as well. So with two other friends, we've done a literature review of this gigantic body of work in a very long JIPS paper, some 50 pages long. So basically, just want to say we are interconnected. And in the first body of work, GVC, right? So I'm going to give you some conceptual foundation, but some of you are not in this kind of thing, so I shall not go into great detail, but just want to say that GVC research tends to focus on the governance structure of value chains, if you like. All right, so there are some very significant papers published in Review of International Political Economy, for example, 2005. Then there are many studies that show how getting involved in GVCs can enable or disable industrial upgrading, value capture, and so on. So John Humphrey's work in regional studies, Mudambi's work in general economic geography, and so on and so forth. In the second body of work, which is something that I'm more familiar with, Neil, myself, and others, we, as James mentioned, we were the Manchester gang, right? We started this body of research in Manchester, very collaborative, transnational, known as GPN 1.0, together with my PhD supervisor, Peter Dicken, and others, Jeff Henderson. We published some of the early work, but of course, today I will show you more GPN 2.0 associated with, if you like, the work done at NUS GPN Center. Essentially from 2015 onwards, particularly in relation to our Oxford University Press book, which lays the conceptual or theoretical foundation of this body of work. Neil and I did an introduction to that body of work in Journal Economic Geography a few years ago. You would, if you do GVC research, you will have seen this diagram. Right, this is the diagram of Gary Giraffe, John Humphrey, and Tim Sturgeon's 2005 extremely well-cited influential paper on the governance of global value chain, published in Review of International Political Economy. I'm proud to say I was the handling editor at that time, accepting the paper. So at least done some pride to the journal, and being one of the highly cited, almost 10,000 soon, all right, citations. So it is the most cited paper in GVC GPN research. And we were lucky a few years ago, we could meet at the Society for Advancement of Socioeconomics in New York, and Gary, John Humphrey, and Tim Sturgeon. So we are interconnected. And Gary and I, a month earlier, also met up with RAM in Google headquarters in Dublin with the group of international business scholars. So basically, I just want to show you that we are very much interconnected in terms of interpersonal relationship, in terms of intellectual inferences, and so on and so forth. That will be all on the intellectual context. Let me go more specifically to GPN 2.0. All right, so things get a bit more complicated, get a bit more, if you like, in-depth now. So in our 2015 book, we have outlined, if you like, the theory. The theory is such that the dynamics, which can be known as independent variable, there are 4 of them: cost capability ratio, market making, financial discipline, risk environment. Depending on the kind of firms you're looking at, will lead to different kind of strategies. Strategies that are more intra-firm in orientation, means internalization or outsourcing, inter-firm control or inter-firm partnership, or extra-firm relationship with non-firm entities like the state, NGO, labor unions, and so on. And this will have certain kind of recursive effects. So in short, under different conditions, different independent variables, different firm strategies will take place within each global production network. And what has that got to do with geography? The geography part comes in after the dynamics shape the strategies, will in turn create certain kind of value capture trajectories that ultimately lead to very different, uneven development outcomes. So for today's purpose, I'm not going into this on the right-hand side. I will focus more on the dynamics and strategies within electronics global production networks. All right, that's only for today's purpose. But of course, conceptually, as I have done so in the regional studies annual lecture last 2 years ago, which is published, you can download open access. You can see one GPN led by a particular lead firm. Every GPN, Neil and I would define it as led by one global lead firm. So unlike value chain study, we focus on each lead firm and its GPN. Yeah, its GPN comprises a whole range of partners, producers, suppliers, customers, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of how Silicon Valley, and this is actually an HP example, if you like, Hewlett Packard, together with its partners in Taiwan, help us to understand how HP's GPN bring the 2 regions of the world together, interact, and lead to certain kind of development outcome for Silicon Valley and for Taiwan as well. It's just an example, but there are numerous others. This is just a conceptual way of understanding this. Okay, let me go into the specificity of my study. So this is an empirical study, right? Spending some money from the $5 million that we had. First, we need to look at ICT, right? So today I'm looking at electronics, broadly conceived as ICT, information communication technologies, the hardware side, not the software. The hardware at its peak, 2018, actually the latest peak is 2021 now. All of you, me, have been buying a lot of ICT devices, so to speak. So, but the 2021 data hasn't come out, so to speak. So stick with 2018, the peak of smartphone, semiconductors then, and also PCs, so to speak. And it's worth about 2.7 trillion, about 14% of world's merchandise trade. So it's very, very significant. In which 2 segments are the biggest by revenue: PCs and mobile handsets. Mobile handset means smartphones, basically. All right. The 2, if we count all the firms that OBIS or Osiris include, is worth about 3.5 trillion in 2018 in terms of the total revenue of these 48,000 firms that are presumably in PCs and smartphones. They are very big. All right. In my study, I focus on the top 20 to 30 such lead firms in each of the 4 segments: semiconductors, PCs, mobile handsets, and consumer electronics, primarily TVs, all right? Because TV panels are part of what's called optical semiconductors. During 2017-18, together with my postdoc and some research assistants, we have gone around Asia to conduct quite a large number of interviews with many lead firms. And some of you colleagues in Taiwan, South Korea, and China, thank you for hosting my visits. It was great fun to have spend time with you there. On top of doing the actual research work. So it's great fun. Through the empirical fieldwork, we've interviewed about 37 global lead firms. They are the 37 lead firms in all 4 major segments. In PCs, all top 5 we have interviewed. In mobile handset, 2 of the top 4. Semiconductors, 3 of the top 6, 10 of the top 16, and consumer electronics. So 25 of the firms we interview have more than $10 billion revenue in 2018. So we're talking about very, very significant firms. 44 interviews are at vice president or higher, including some of the major, many of the firms, the chief supply chain officers, the chief technology officers, as well as, again, some of the chief operating officers. There was, I think, no CEO, though, if I recall correctly. So, but hey, $10 billion company CEO, not easy to get hold, right? On top of that, I've also acquired proprietary data from the IHS Market Informer in 2016 and 2019, 2 period, and you will see the data later. Of course, much more in detail in the book itself. Very, very specific kind of data, customized on all kinds of top suppliers in each of the 4 segments, time series based, about 20 years, 2000 to 2019 Q3, roughly. All right, so you will see some results later on of that empirical material. By and large, you will say in smartphone, if you like, right, the most significant segment, the top 24 firms are basically the biggest, very significant. We've interviewed about half, 12 of them. In PCs, the top 20 firms almost account for 40% of the revenue already, all right? And then semiconductors, smaller, and then consumer electronics, relatively smaller. So these are the 4 major segments of global electronics. But you may say, hey, semiconductor is not the same as the other 3. Yes, correct. Semiconductors will be intermediate goods. So in my book, in my presentation, I will still first talk about semiconductors as inputs, then into the finished goods such as PCs, smartphones, and to a certain extent, TVs, so to speak. Let me start giving you some idea of what a semiconductor global production network will look like. Remember, we're talking about lead firms. There are 2 kinds of semiconductor lead firms. Lead firms that has its own wafer manufacturing or chip manufacturing facilities, such as Intel, Samsung, to lead firms that do not have any manufacturing capability, by and large, outsourced to manufacturers. So this will be the Apple, AMD, Qualcomm, and so on and so forth, all right? And it will outsource to foundries, we call foundry wafer, such as TSMC, the world's leading one, Samsung, Global Foundry in Singapore, UMC in Singapore from Taiwan as well, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, some of the packaging company at ASE, we went all the way to Tainan to interview the COO of ASE, who has provided us wonderful information about the semiconductor industry. And all this eventually will feed into PCs, smartphones, and other users. All right. Now, what's important is not so much at some of these steps. Some of these steps are important. This is the silicon that goes into the wafer, the software that help you to design the chip circuits, the masks that help you to, if you like, photocopy onto the surface of the wafer. This will be what the fab looks like. What is important is the next one, is this machine. It's the EUV machine, the most advanced technology currently by a company, Dutch company called ASML. This is the machine, the photocopying machine that you must have if you want to be at the frontier of semiconductor manufacturing. Put it in short, this is the machine that Trump and Biden wouldn't want China to have, which is happening, all right? And how does it work? Go to the ASML website, all right? By the way, ASML was formerly related to Philips Semiconductors, all right? ASML, interestingly, on their website says changing the world 1 nanometer at a time. If you can see 1 nanometer, oh, you don't have to attend this seminar. You'll be brilliant, super, all right? Only 1 nanometer. This is a machine that must be required if you want to manufacture at 10 nanometer or smaller scale, if you like. The machine is gigantic. This is a human, okay? Machine is very big. Look at these guys assembling the machine. Each machine photocopy, so to speak, through extreme ultraviolet light onto the surface through some chemical process to reproduce the circuitry. That's more, all right, onto the surface of the wafer. Now, what's the big deal? Well, the machine, according to the CEO, as a photocopier, is only 200 million euro each. And ASML only makes last year, 2021, 40 units. This year, expect 2022, 55 units. And TSMC's latest fab in Tainan require roughly about 50 units of it. So you can imagine there is tremendous demand for this machine, Intel, Samsung, and TSMC, but ASML can only make so many. Why? I will come back to that later if you're interested, okay? Basically, very difficult, many bottlenecks in the production of chips, put it in short. Now, what about final product, finished product? Brand name OEMs like Apple, my favorite, or Dell, or Samsung. You will have the laptop, smartphones with its own supply chain management, each having a supplier, such as chips and other things like panels, the metal parts, and so on and so forth, and outsourced typically to Taiwanese original ODM, original design manufacturers, or EMS, such as Foxconn, or in-house production facility in the case of Samsung, and then of course produce the final product that goes into the end market. All this seems very simple, right? But if I lay semiconductors over with those products, what will happen? And by the way, this is the simpler version, right? There is a more complex version. So you see, it's rather complicated. A typical global production network that you will have, number one, chip design in Silicon Valley. All right. Number two, you need 2.1, you need design software, which is very much US technology control at the moment. Then you need chip equipment. Just that UV machine alone costs you trouble, because in the Netherlands, you may not be able to get it, even if you have money. And then you need raw material, typically Japanese and Taiwanese currently. Then the fabs are located in Hsinchu, or in the case of Samsung, is in Gihong and other parts. Then the chips are made, of course, then you have a back end finished. Then you go into PCB production, printed circuit board, put it in, then assembly into products in different parts of East Asia. By East means Northeast and Southeast Asia, and to a certain extent South Asia as well, to be the finished product that goes everywhere else. Roughly, this is what it looks like. Can't you see it as more or less interconnecting different regions of the world together? Kind of. All right. Reality is much more complex. So what are the actual players? Let me give you some sense at least. All right. So if you look at semiconductors, 2010, 2020, typically top 10 in share increase about 10%. So top 10 semicon firms are now controlling more than 55% of the market. And what are they? Samsung, Intel, the two biggest, followed by relatively smaller ones. If you look at revenue, all right, if you look at SK Hynix memory, you look at Micron from the US memory, the two of them add up is roughly about the same as Samsung, all right. Then you may ask, what about TSMC? TSMC, I thought it's very big. Yes, TSMC is very big because it's making chips for Broadcom, all right. We're here, Qualcomm, all right, and NVIDIA, all right. These are all chip design firms only. So they are $10 billion, if you like. And as far as Apple, Apple is TSMC's biggest customer, 25% of $50 billion revenue of TSMC. So that's what the semiconductor industry looks like, both in terms of GPN, in terms of the leading player and the dominance of the top 10, so to speak. Now, what about mobile handset? Mobile handset is even more concentrated. The top 10 control 80% of the market. 10 years ago, it was only 60%. All right, when Nokia then was number one. Nokia in 2010 was 40% market share. If you knew iPhone would be so successful, you wouldn't be here attending this talk today. You have bought Apple shares and you will be paying for my professorship, so to speak. Yeah. The moral of the story is none of us knew, not even Nokia. So Nokia today, 1% of the market share, right? Look at who are the big shots. Samsung, Huawei has gone down since 2020 for obvious reason due to a US sanction. Apple, Xiaomi, Oppo, and so on. And so basically these brands are the big players right now. That's in terms of smartphone. What about PCs, right? PCs means including Apple Macintosh computers, yeah, since I'm the Debian Mac user. Now, 2010, 2020, again, top 10, already very significant. Top 10, 70%. And that share increases to 85. And because year 2021 is the all-time peak of laptop order, for obvious reason, we all stuck at home, we need new laptops. So the number will get even bigger. And the top 4, 5, very, very significant. HP, Lenovo, Dell is slightly smaller already. And then Acer, Asus, and Apple share relatively smaller than the top 3. The top 3 are very big. Just the 3 of them alone is 70% roughly. All right, just the top 3 notebook brands, yeah, remember. TV, I can skip TV probably. Yeah, TV is very Asia. Okay, it's all South Korean, China, and Japanese only, basically. Nothing out of Asia in terms of the lead firms. Yeah. Okay, so here comes, so to speak, the second half of the presentation. And not too bad, I still have 22 minutes to go, whereby I would then, first of all, roughly explain these 4 key observations of this entire electronics industry, 4 segments throughout the 2010s. 2010s, remember. We need to know what happened in the 2010s in order to project into the 2020s, so to speak. First finding, the geographical configuration of GPN very much centered on East Asia, but also variegated depending on the segment. So high concentration in specific East Asian economy. For example, the most advanced logic chips that were done in Taiwan, all right? And much memory chips will be made in South Korea and Japan. And then of course, virtually 95% to 97% of all notebooks, whatever brands, would be assembled in China by Taiwanese ODM firms. However, in desktop PCs, it's a lot more globalized, partly because desktops are heavy. So even Apple has assembly plants somewhere to assemble the Apple desktop for customers in Europe and Latin America. How do we know? Well, I have okay. So I do want to say a bit more about semiconductors. Okay, so the next table gives you some sense of semiconductors. I have more detailed information in the book, but basically I want to use this table, which is forthcoming in Economic Geography, the journal, because it's easier to read this one, easier to read. Yeah, the others are more complicated. Now, if you look at 3 years, 2000 millennium, 2010, and I had data up to 2018. Remember, this is data calculated from every single fab in the world. Every single fab, I have information that looks like this. I will have Intel, Chandler. I know in every year, the fab's name, the process technology there, what are the customers, and the output in 8-inch equivalent. All right, so I have data all the way back from 1970s to 2019, 2020 to 22, based on published public media information. All right, so that's how I arrived at the previous table. So basically, let's look at the previous table. You will have some good sense. In year 2000, let's look at total output, okay? Capacity means number of wafers per month. The US was about 1,000, let me see, this is 1,300. Okay, so the equivalent is in thousands. So basically 1.3 million, the US, 1.3 million wafers per month in 2000. 2018, US is about 1.7 million wafers per month. Not much increase, some increase, all right? Look at Taiwan. In year 2000, had 724,000. And now Taiwan is the biggest, 4 million wafers coming out of Taiwan per month, all right? And don't even talk about technology level, higher, right? And Taiwan basically corners the foundry market. 3 million of wafers in logic, means all of the advanced application processes, except Intel's processes, so to speak. China is trying to catch up. So from very low base to quite big now, China's total output is 2 million. All right. South Korea is very big in memory for a long period of time. It was already very big in 2000, but it's 3.5 million now. Japan remains an important player, but primarily in memory only and associated with Toshiba. Okay, so it's a particular company, and the name is all Kioxia right now. Now, what's interesting is about Europe. Europe used to be quite big, 845, and marginal increase to 1 million. And the lowly Singapore, we used to have 167K, but due to wonderful work done by EDB, total output, we have more than the entire Europe added up. So Singapore per month produces in 2018, 1.04 million wafers. And the entire Europe added up is 1.01. So you can get a feel of the relative shift, yeah, geographical shift in output. Of course, we can go into the process technology, the kind of chips made and so on, but you can see why Trump and Biden were very worried, all right? The US is losing out. The US role in global semiconductor manufacturing is shrinking, and that's why the 52 billion act is trying to address that huge decline from 2000 to the past 20 years, basically. What about all the other products? Okay, let's look at mobile handset. If you look at mobile handset again, 2018 data, you will find that except in the case of Samsung, much of it is was assembled in Vietnam. The majority of smartphones, a lot of it will be in China. All right, vis-a-vis Vietnam, which will be primarily Samsung space, and then India was coming up quite fast, 2018. So China and India basically dominates, and together with Vietnam for Samsung. the three of them, East and South Asia. And then of course you have others, lesser known brands in other parts of the world that assemble smartphones. This is the assembly side, all right? Of course, you can talk about design and so on and so forth. In desktop notebooks, again, notebook production, China is dominant, basically, the vast majority, 90% Some of you are experts and doing the research here as well. And in terms of desktop, China's significance will be much less, right? Partly because of the weight and other factors. Mexico is important for supplying the entire Americas and others as well. TV production, again, highly globalized throughout the world, all right? So this data is just very quickly give you some sense of the geographical, again, based on very detailed data. So I have very detailed HP, which year, which ODM, make how many unit shipments, Apple, which of the Foxconn factory, in which location, how many units shipped, all right? So it's aggregated from there, so to speak. So you get some sense, right? There is a high degree of concentration in East Asia. There is still significant variation within that high concentration. Second point, second key observation about the 2010s is that there is significant also difference between lead firms in the same segment. Some lead firms choose to internalize everything or as much as possible. Some outsource as much as possible, even though they are direct competitors. Best example, Samsung and Apple. Apple outsource everything, Samsung internalize as much as possible. In PCs, Lenovo, China, right? Formerly IBM. Lenovo, roughly half outsourced, half in-house. And then HP, all outsourced, right? So in that sense, the top three firms for each of the segments may do things very differently. And what about Intel? Intel is in-house primarily, and the competitor AMD, 100% outsourced to Global Foundry, TSMC, and so on and so forth. So basically, the moral of the story is you can't generalize and say, oh, no. Value chain of smartphone is all outsourced. Not true. Samsung doesn't do that. Yeah. If you say value chain is all internalized, then where is the global production network? How can it be globalized, right? Because you need to bring the suppliers and others in. So it's in that spirit that my findings, at least in this electronics industry, is to tell you in the same segment, among the biggest competitive firms, they choose different strategies, meaning there must be reasons behind that, right? And the third observation is to say during the 2010s, East Asia, by East, again, I mean Northeast and Southeast Asia, yeah? East Asia was no longer just the dominant market making the goods, assembling the final product, and hence demand for intermediate products. East Asia has been the major market for intermediate goods, means things that go into the final products for a long period of time since the 1990s. But East Asia, during the past, particularly 5-8 years, became also the dominant end market for at least quite a number of the segments. Smartphone, biggest. TVs, biggest. PC, kind of on par with Europe and North America. So in that sense, if you think of the final products in the global electronics industry, East Asia is not just the producer, but also the consumer to a large extent now, all right? And the key factors for many of the firms that we can explain or account for their successes has to do with their supply chain capabilities, how they manage effectively. One of the key parameters in our theory, cost capability ratio, and we'll come back to that. How do you become cheaper and more capable, and hence cost over capability becomes lower? And how do you control production capacity that many chip makers and automakers right now face that problem? Yeah, production capacity based on market demand forecasts, so on and so forth. So these are very significant issues at stake. Final observation about the late 2010s is that the technological challenges became very, very significant. On the one hand, if you look at semiconductors, the cutting edge technology has moved on so fast, so difficult, so finite at 7 to 10 nano, and then 5 to 7 later, and then now it's at 3 to 5 nano level competition. And only 3 firms can do it: Intel, TSMC, and Samsung. And you need $15 to $30 billion per fab in order to achieve that level of process technology. Very difficult, isn't it? And this is how small and the evolution of semiconductor manufacturing technologies. In Other related industries, again, tremendous technological innovations are taking place that require cutting-edge electronics inputs in automotive, in aerospace, medical equipment, digital economy, servers, or your Instagram data will need to be kept somewhere. And hence, there is a great deal more demand for electronics inputs. Even toys need many chips nowadays. Yeah. Okay, look at automotive industry, right? Since I started with Mercedes. Interestingly, cars are no longer about mechanical parts, not even electric cars. I mean, conventional combustion engine cars, all right, require a lot of electronics. Expensive cars nowadays, the new Mercedes is about 30% electronics, all right, and eventually it will go 50%. So if you look at many, NXP was formerly Philips merged with Motorola to be now the leading auto chip supplier to BMW and many others. NVIDIA designed not just graphics chips for you to play games, but also for future electronics, EVs, if you like, electronic vehicles. And there is a lot of stuff in a typical car nowadays, all right? So, okay, so in the remaining time, let me explain a little bit how this works out in theory, right? So originally, I showed you earlier how four of the, if you like, independent variable drives firms to adopt certain kind of strategies that help us to understand why the outcomes are different. Yeah, it's important to know that the outcomes are not necessarily the same, even though they're the same firm from the same country of origin. In our 2015 paper in economic geography, we have actually mapped it out, all right, but across many different industries. So firms may adopt more intra-firm coordination if their cost capability ratio, market imperative, financial disciplines are high or low, and so on and so forth. Now I shall just show you how it works out in the electronics industry. In the semiconductor industry, clearly it's not so much about cost per se. It's not about being cheap. It's about heavy financial investments. So 3 takes given. Also risk factor very high, as we know. Yeah, semiconductor, both in terms of environmental risk and of course geopolitical risk, as we can tell now. Yeah, I think, okay, I will skip that. So what you find is that in terms of what happened in the past 10 years, the new investment in fabs very much concentrated in East Asia, predominantly by a few very large East Asian firms outside China, plus of course China's tremendous investment in new fab capacity. Yeah, the only one different, the only outlier, so to speak, is Intel in the US. Only Intel can still keep up, so to speak. Partly, one may argue, is due to patient capital in East Asia, whereas if you are from Europe, North America, you'll find that investment in fabs, you just can't justify to Wall Street, so to speak. In personal computers, it's not so much about financial discipline, but much more about cost capability ratios. The availability of very, very capable logistical and supplier ecosystems in the location where you manufacture personal computers. So many of you will have thought, oh, well, we can bring PC manufacturing back to the US. It doesn't work. You don't have a low cost capability ratio in logistics and supply networks there, which makes it very difficult to bring laptop production back to the US. What about Apple bringing iPhone back to the US? Doesn't work either, because in this very same segment, the same set of factors applied. You need low cost capability ratio, means the one who assembles the phone will have to be able to keep costs low enough and capability high enough. Very important. And as I told you, Asia Pacific market is becoming very important. In fact, APAC is the biggest customer of iPhone and everything else. So why would you want to assemble back in the US? So it just doesn't work, not quite possible. TV is very dominated in Asia, but due to the weight, so there is still quite a lot of final assembly throughout the world for large panel displays. So coming to the final few slides, then let's talk a little bit about the challenges in this decade. All right, we've just started. This is March 2022. We know geopolitical tensions are up and actually getting worse. It seems that this will be a very significant disruptive factor in terms of risk to the interconnected worlds I'm showing you in the past decade, so to speak. And this is something we have to learn and see what will happen. Second is that technological competition has become even hotter, even more difficult, right? So in chip production, there is a great deal about how can we even make smaller nano chips below 3 nanometer. It's going to be already the limits of what's called the Moore's law. And of course, the current chip shortages, there are plenty of reasons I can go into it if Q&A you're interested in, that will also last for a few years. But the problem with semiconductor industry is that there is a lot of current investment that will lead to future oversupply and then slump in prices. Then some semicon firms will go bust, so on and so forth. So the industry always goes through that boom bust factor. Others have argued that, hey, no. If you look at what Henry has presented, no, there is too much manufacturing dependency on East Asia. We need to reshore. We need to bring some back. Easy to say, very difficult to do. Why? You want to decouple from China? Sure, but where do you go? You go to Southeast Asia? Possible, but then is the cost capability ratio similar? Possible. If you look at what Samsung has done in Vietnam over 10 years, Samsung managed to get out of Guizhou and Tianjin in the manufacturing of the smartphones to then move and develop ecosystem in Vietnam. It takes time, not easy. It's not over 1-2 years, right? So we will expect China to remain as the dominant manufacturing center together with many other East Asian economies. Why? If you look at recent information, very difficult. Global FDI was declining. FDI within East Asia still growing despite global decline. Geographical proximity, even Foxconn pledged to move outside of China, and yet only by 5%. All right, it's still 70% of Foxconn's activities in China. Some of the Chinese firms themselves also relocate to Southeast Asia. So actually, if you look at FDI coming to ASEAN, there is a lot of China origin firms. Some 40% of manufacturing FDI in ASEAN comes from Chinese firms, which in turn will help build the ecosystem and hence lower cost capability ratio for Taiwanese ODM, for global lead firms to start manufacturing in our parts of the world, so to speak. But this is still within East Asia. Yeah, East Asia means Northeast and Southeast. It's from Northeast come to a bit to Southeast. Reshoring back to the US doesn't work. All right, one of the key laptop, basically, you know, it's either HP or Dell, but I won't tell you which one. The chief supply chain officer said it doesn't make sense because all the parts you bring back to the US to assemble that computer, you still have to pay tariffs. So what's the point, right, of bringing the laptop production back to the US? And of course, even if you look at US, Mexico, Canada agreement, there are all kinds of complicated issues. So decoupling isn't that easy. Even in that agreement, the US was trying to decouple its dependency on Mexico and Canada. What about more defensive, protectionist kind of interventions? I don't think it's very effective. If you look at the 52 billion Chips for America Act, by the way, CHIPS stands for creating healthy incentives for the production of semiconductors for America. That's CHIPS, all right, the full spelling. I argue it won't save Intel, so to speak. China has put it into 150 billion bigger fund to save SMIC. Now let's look at some numbers, all right? If you look at Taiwan, TSMC, Samsung from South Korea, SK Hynix from South Korea, each of them already announced in the next 3 to 5 years, each of them will invest 100 to 150 billion. So what is 50 billion chips? And what is the 150 in the entire China fund? TSMC alone this year is going to invest 40 to 44 billion dollars. Look at Intel this year, 27 billion. So you see, it's not so simple, right? The leaders are so much more advanced now that makes it very difficult for the nations to catch up if you're not if you're not Taiwan or South Korea in that sense. So China will find it a hard time. America will find it a hard time. But America control some other key technologies in chip design and equipment, yeah, remember. And some argue industrial renaissance, right? Try to be made in X, Y, Z. And I think made in X, Y, Z industrial policy, there are fundamental inherent limits. First, I don't believe the state knows how to do it. The states don't know better than firms today. In 30, 40 years ago, when the developmental state in Japan, in South Korea, and to a certain extent Taiwan and Singapore, yes, the state bureaucrats knew better. But today, I don't think so. And it very often leads to perverse policy outcome. Look at Foxconn in Wisconsin. When this guy tried to, open up for Terry Guo, Foxconn in Wisconsin, today what happened? You look at that display plant that was pledged, it's very small. The case of TSMC in Arizona is also very perverse, but I don't have time to explain in great detail. But basically, it's not a big deal compared to what TSMC has in Taiwan. so to speak. In my 2016 book, I talk a bit about, if you think of industrial development, all right, industrial transformation, it's not about you want the whole production network value chain in your country. You want to be in the strategic segments. You want to couple with the right part of GPN or GVCs in order to develop well. I think that's the fundamental message. Nationalization of the entire production network won't solve any problem. It's too costly. But also, I think it's fair to say many lead firms are diversifying away from China-centric production networks to at least China plus 1, China plus 2, and so on and so forth. That create tremendous opportunities of strategic coupling for Southeast Asia, for South Asia, and things like that can happen. And I have 2 minutes to go. And pro-ecosystem approach is extremely important to developing strategic coupling with global production networks. Last 2 slides is to talk about research agenda. One is to say, okay, we often hear global supply chain problem, toilet paper running out, critical medical supplies do not have, so on. It's all to do with a supply chain problem. Remember, supply chain problems are the symptoms. Underlying it will be the industrial organization, which is the global production networks. So in that sense, you need to figure out the GPM problem. In what sense is a GPM problem? Yeah, supply chain per se is a manifestation of a GPM problem. In my 2021 paper, I talk a bit about this. You need to open up the black box. It takes time. It takes a lot of effort and money too, by the way, if you look at the kind of research I'm doing. So you also need to understand the causal drivers and the competitive outcomes. And finally, the role of the state has always been, I think, overstated in terms of intervention into GVCs and GPN. Not so simple. It's very difficult for the state to influence. Why? Because as I told you, each GPN is led by one lead firm, and there are many lead firms, and it's very difficult to get all of them to act together in a highly coordinated and collective way. So, and the final agenda, yeah, okay. So it's in terms of technology, I did not bring in the digital economy much in this body of work. It's more the hardware. So I think there is a lot that we can do to bring in the digital platform economy in understanding the technological evolution in global electronics. We can also talk a lot about network resilience in terms of understanding how network resilience become important. And then the politics of production networks, of course, is ongoing right now. It's something that doesn't go away easily, and it will be around for this entire decade. So on that, I shall thank you for attending. Our department admin staff has said that she will be able to put the Zoom recording link on Geography Now, this page on our department homepage. So feel free to visit. You can then, if you can't sleep at night, you're welcome to watch this presentation again. I'm sure you sleep well. Thank you. Look forward to talking to many of you.
Thank you very much, Henry.
James, back to you.
And thanks, everyone. There's already questions coming in. So I think I'll just try and work. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of questions already, but I'm going to try and work through them. I think I probably won't, if it's okay with the audience, I won't invite you to ask your question, because if I do, it could get quite messy. Instead, if you feel I've asked your question incorrectly, perhaps you can shout.
James, maybe more efficient for me to just look at it and answer immediately.
If you prefer,
I can see it, yeah. And since I know this question inside out, I should be able
happy to do that.
Okay. And then what I suggest we do is I give quick answers to the written questions, and then we open up and see if some of you want to talk.
If you feel you want to do it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So let me start with.
I'll just hold back then.
Hi. I think the first question came from. Yong Vuk. Okay, there is Derek first. Why? Okay, Derek's question start first at 4:04 p.m. Why did semicon of so many firms decline between that period? Oh, okay. So not so many, but some have declined because the industry become even more concentrated. So the leaders have captured even more business from the relatively weaker one, the follower, if you like. So TSMC's revenue increased so much to 50 billion 2021, and that increase must have come from also somebody's missing business, so to speak. So it's in that sense, there is and of course there is also overall growth. Last year was the highest in semicon, over $500 billion of the industry. It appears that firm level concentration is no longer growing. No, it is growing, I think. 2018 to 2021, I would say. It's become even more concentrated in the top 5, so to speak. And then next question, Yongbuk at 423. Your question is, countries have become more willing to sacrifice for national security. How does national security? Okay, so national security doesn't focus much in my argument per se, except that it's an important risk factor. So if you think of the 4 conditions, the 4 causal drivers, the risk environment is very important. Now, having interviewed many of the firms at the time when Trump already started the trade war, every firm had to, if you like, digest geopolitical risks, interstate conflicts differently. All right, and that in a way lead to different outcomes. Some get it right, some get it wrong, and it's just a fact of life. Okay, no CEOs can predict everything. It's the same thing. So in that sense, unfortunately, national security is more, how do I put it? At actually what firms actually do is highly variable. There is no single way to, if you like, generalize about it, so to speak. All right, what's risk to one firm may be less a risk to another firm. Will the US effort to reorganize this succeed? This is asked me to predict the future. As you can tell from my last slide or last few slides, I'm less optimistic. I'm also reading quite a lot of the industry's own talks, and quite a lot of industry players don't feel it's going to work that well. I mean, the $250 billion, as you know, 52 is not really much. All right, and Intel will probably get half of it, and then the other guys are not too happy, Micron and the other US ones. So I'm not that confident. Consumer product, I don't think it will work, right? And the next question, intersectoral M&A important in recent change. Intersectoral, you mean electronics vis-a-vis non-electronics firms? Don't know. I don't study that, so I will have to skip that. Chang's iPad. That next question, 425. Samsung is building. Just announced the vice chair after coming out of the jail to Austin. And so on, and built one in Europe. These are all small chicken fabs, relative speaking, relative to what Samsung is actually investing in South Korea, right? So partly for political reason, of course, just like TSMC has also announced interest in investing in Europe, all right? But again, these are relatively modest fabs. It has to be done. For, one may argue, the geopolitical risk mitigation, so to speak. There are more complications. Okay, put it in short is that just because a fab is built in one location doesn't mean that you as a customer can use it, because the process in that fab needs to be certified, qualified. If you're an automaker, you only use qualified fabs, right? Because all of us, I mean, those of you who drive cars, you don't want your car to fail. One chip fail, you die, and you don't want that to fail. So every chip, once assigned that fab, 20 years. For 20 years, that process will be locked in. So just because you have a new fab doesn't mean you can then make that same chip. Yeah, as simple as that. It's quite difficult. There is a lot of lock-in in semiconductors, so to speak, which in turn explains the chip shortages problem. Florian's question about China +1 relocation from China by divestment to Southeast Asia, how relevant? Relevant. So you see, the most interesting case study, I gave like 3-4 pages in the book to it, is Samsung's move to Vietnam in smartphone. Yeah. Samsung kind of predicted in advance and moved and did well. Yeah, and I will see more happening even among Chinese players. So if you like Oppo, Xiaomi, and the like, will also move to a certain extent to Southeast Asia. They have already moved Xiaomi, for example, some production to India, and so on and so forth. So China +1 will have to be the way to go. Have to be. Yang Chen's question. About conceptual framework and then model for finding. Okay, yes. Will the new book lead to GPN 3.0? No. Ask Neil, right? We have no plan at the moment to come up with a new version of GPN. I think 2.0, as far as I'm concerned, seems to work. Amazingly, in 2015 or slightly earlier when we wrote it, we never thought the world would be like this today, isn't it? So in other words, the risk factor becomes so big, but we explicitly built risk into 2.0. And it seems to help us to then precisely understand how risk help understanding firm level strategies, risk from national security to geopolitical conflicts to environmental risk, by the way, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Magdalene's question for 27, NUS possible from perspective of water. This water, okay, water is a big deal in chip manufacturing. Use a lot of water, right? If Singapore not enough water to drink, I'm sorry, we have to cut our wafer fabs. Now that's the most straightforward way. Very important, but I have no expertise to tell more except to say that if you look at Taiwan's drought last year, it worries many of TSMC's customers, including Apple. All right, so it is a significant factor, and hence again, if you think of the basic parameters required for wafer fab, advanced wafer fab, you need water, stability in water supply. You need stability in electricity. You cannot have earthquake. All these three factors. Anything goes wrong, straight away, whole batch of chips will be useless, and millions of dollars lost in the fab. So many environmental factors are required. Why? Because it's so delicate, right? 3 nanometer. You know how big. So in that sense, water and other environmental factors are extremely important. A fair question. Chang's iPad, firm pursue similar, but also compare if you have similar to others, you cannot have. Okay, so you may pursue similar strategies, but because you may have different base to begin with, you may come from different country origin. For example, some argue that those lead firms from China have better access to capital market and state funding. So in that sense, you may still come out more successful than the other competitor in that sense of the word, because not all are equal in that sense. Yeah. In many of the East Asian firms, there will be also what is called intra-firm subsidies, cross-subsidization within, say, conglomerate groups from Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and so on and so forth. Yeah. DK question: how do you see firm configuration strategy change with respect to geopolitical changes? Don't know yet. I have to do the research, because by geopolitical change you mean the current happenings. So I need to go back to them. All right, because the book interviews were done just before the big geopolitical changes. There was trade war in it, but there wasn't the huge geopolitical issues that at stake right now. Yeah. Guanan Zhou's question: lead firms have a bargaining power to do something. Protectionism? No, actually. I think, to be fair, even TSMC doesn't have, so to speak, that kind of bargaining power to tell big countries what to do, to be fair. So I think capitalist firms are capitalist firms, all right? No matter how you just can't overcome the state, so to speak. So it's in that sense, I don't believe lead firms have that kind of bargaining power when it comes to what national leaders might think. All right. Jen Fast's question. Okay, exactly about the role of the state. What's the role of state in China on industry? Big, very important. Is it a kind of developmental state we experience in South Korea, Taiwan in their time? Not really. I don't really consider China's state as so-called the developmental state, because there are peculiar characters that you need to build in, such as what Peter Evans called embedded autonomy, what Robert Wade will call pilot agency, and the late Alice Amston will call you need to, again, get prices wrong. China get prices wrong, but then you don't have the nodal agency to coordinate, so to speak. Role of the state is many ministry, which in turn lead to inter-ministry rivalry, and hence lower efficacy of industrial policy in that sense of the word. So, Florence, next question: do you observe any resilient orientation in industry due to more or less continuous tendency? I think there are shifts, because in some follow-up interviews and reading, it seems that some firms are already responding by adopting, for example, China +1, or building, if you like, start at least asking suppliers to move to some other locations outside, again, China, or could be even East Asia. For example, some go to India. So there is effort to diversify, in that sense, building resilience into it. Anthony's question: innovation center in GPN. Yep, the Greater Bay. I missed Jamie's talk this morning. Yeah, my mother had to go clinic, so I had to rush. This change press can. Difficult question. Ask Professor Pack. No, kidding. They haven't started the research probably. I don't know. I mean, the answer to GBA is that it's tough to tell at this point. Yeah, I mean, it's something that is an interesting idea, kind of like the whole Bay Californian way of thinking. I don't know. I mean, partly because I think in this Bay Area, GBA area, it has the manufacturing capability, But in terms of, if you like, the soft side, the competitive culture that really characterize Silicon Valley, that aspect, I'm not sure. Also, whether the best people in the world go to GPA, I'm also not sure. All right, I can tell you honestly, when I studied in Hong Kong, my secondary school, all the top students are now still in Silicon Valley. Yeah, so Silicon Valley get the best of Asia, unfortunately, and we try to get them back, right, in Singapore or in Hong Kong or South Korea, but ultimately difficult, relatively speaking. So GPA, you can possibly attract the best of China, but you need to attract the best of the world, but that is difficult. That part is difficult compared to Silicon Valley. Yeah. Kim Fun's question. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, and
It's
then
not
Terrence.
a question.
Huh? Yeah, Terrence. Okay. Okay. Singapore has recently bidden into new Wi-Fi. Yes. And then Singapore moving away from electronics. Yes. Impact on. Okay. Now I don't want to comment on whether our life science drive is the right one because I don't have expertise to deal with that. But what about electronics? Our electronics has always been the corner of Singapore's manufacturing industry. I think Casey used to write about Singapore's electronics industry, labor, and so on. So I think the past 2 years have shown us convincingly that it's the electronics that carry our manufacturing industry, which in turn carry our GDP, right? So in a way, thanks to not having chase out all the electronics, particularly the high value added electronics, including, of course, our former chairman of the NUS Board of Trustees, right? His company, Venture Corp, all right? Venture Corp is one of the top electronics manufacturing service provider, EMS. So in that sense, there is still a lot of electronics activity in Singapore, which I think is great, is important. But we just have to continue to, if you like, move up, so to speak, the value chain in that sense. And then Confu's question, India will emerge as, this is an interesting question. My short answer is no. All right, why? Why am I pessimistic? I already said at the beginning, right? You need those three conditions, which already within India, not so easy to find. Water, electricity, and then infrastructure, which are stable. All three must be there to begin with. Then capital investment, then ecosystem. Now, a fab is not just build a fab, you need ecosystem. The people who service the equipment, those very expensive equipments, all right, when down, one equipment is down, you just can't make the chips, which in turn, you need to have it up. So it's not so simple. And I think it will, and India, as you know, despite the great success of India in business process outsourcing, yeah, extremely successful, right? In India, many of the big companies in BPOs, business process outsourcing, software, and so on, but hardware means chip manufacturing, none. There was no single fab. Currently, there is talk of investment in packaging. Packaging means after the chip, the wafer made, then you package, and that is the next one, right? So chip making, not easy. Within 10 years, I don't think so. Because as you can tell, even the US is playing catching up in manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing. Okay, the last one, and David, my head of department, so I must look at this very carefully. If I say the wrong thing, I might be dismissed. Does your research include Africa? Oh my God. Very little, okay? African countries have very little role in the global electronics industry, except maybe the consumption side, if you like, as a market. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, PC, TVs, by PC desktop, I mean, another kind of smartphones, certain kind of smartphones have some operations in African countries. I do have data, but it's just that because they're relatively small, so they will be grouped under what's called the others, unfortunately, yeah? So it's in the others categories. Finally, Kishore, yes, before we move on to others, Kishore's geopolitical context gaining momentum, yup. US on the decouple from China, yup. In which area can China, US decouple, and which area will fail? Okay. Now, I will again limit just to electronics industry, broadly conceived. So I think when we talk about the US decoupling with China, we are talking about in advanced telecom and in semiconductors. Now, actually in advanced telecom is the 5G stuff that China, actually Huawei has many patents. So in that sense, that decoupling is trickier. But I think in semicon, there is no reason that the US needs China in that sense, unless, of course, now I have many friends here from Taiwan and China, so I have to be very careful when it comes to China Taiwan relations. When I mention China, let me rephrase mainland China. All right, I'm not going to give anything else except to say mainland China is not so important to the US in semiconductor technology. Rather, it's the other way around. The US can control mainland China semiconductor technology by refusing, right, forbidding American firms, software firms, equipment firms to supply to mainland China fabs. So what mainland China has to do then is to invest in all those software chip manufacturing facilities. Not so simple. To be as advanced up to 3 nano, 5 nano, very difficult. So currently, SMIC is talking about capability probably up to 10, 12 nanometer, self-sufficient, so to speak. It's very difficult because the design software is very complicated. The EDA, electronic design automation software, is primarily 3 or 4 US firms. So very, very difficult. So I don't think, I will think US decoupling from mainland China semicon, doable, no issue, it's happening. But in 5G, it's a tough fight because China has also huge market presence in 5G telecom technology. In PC and smartphone, not really, because it's consumer products, and the US only has Apple in smartphone, in PC only HP and Dell, so to speak. So basically, it's more even field in that sense. Florian's question: China +1 does not necessarily mean direct. Yes, correct. I agree. When we say China +1, it could be additional investments, can be buying insurance, so to speak. Yeah. So it's not about divest. So actually, many surveys have been done already on foreign firms in China. They're not hugely divesting. All right. For those divesting, there are quite a lot of new investment going in as well. So back to James. You can pick some questions and let people ask. Yeah.
I had a question, which was, what's been the biggest research surprise? If you go back to GPN 1.0, you go back to when you were a grad student in Manchester, all these years, what has been the thing that most shocked or surprised you in your research?
In this global electronics research, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
The one I presented, yeah? Which is that, to me, the biggest surprise is how different lead firms were the direct competitors and yet pursue very different strategies and have very different developmental outcomes. So for example, Samsung's smartphone business operation is so important to Vietnam's development. Samsung's electronics, Samsung is something like worth 25% of Vietnam's manufacturing exports, 25% of the entire manufacturing export. Wukong is here, so he's the Vietnam expert. So in that sense, we would have never thought of it 10 years ago. Who would have thought? So it's very significant. And once you go into those details, in my case, we're very lucky. I managed to go to the headquarters of Samsung and spoke to the EVP, Chief Marketing Officer, and 5-6 other VPs. And they gave me a whole day of a briefing about all sorts, including, of course, the reasons for going Vietnam, some of the technical details. And the SVP who looked after me now is the EVP. He was formerly looking after Samsung's manufacturing for Apple's early generation iPhone chips. So I knew exactly the story behind that, why Samsung makes for Apple iPhone chips. So basically, there are many of this kind of well beyond what you get from the public media information that give me a lot of nuanced understanding of how GPN theory, which is never meant to be a grand theory, is meant to be what's called mid-range theory. Yeah, for us to understand the global economy in a kind of reasonably structured and yet modest way. Yeah, thank you. I think Samuk has a question. Samuk, go ahead.
Yes, you started your lecture at first, incredible inequalities in global scale. How do you think about the GPN 2.0 affect global inequalities in terms of inter-country inequalities and intra-country inequalities in the future?
Thank you, Samuk. This is a very important question. I think what you mean is how can we use GPN 2.0, which is kind of theory, to understand and perhaps intervene to make the world less unequal, at least. So I will say, first of all, a theory like this is important because it helps us to understand what's happening, the how, why, and what, and so what questions. Once we have that in mind, then it will help us perhaps to develop the right kind of whether policy interventions, just like some of the critical comments I made towards the end about some of the ineffective, defensive, protectionist policies. And it's in that sense that I will argue that 2.0, which is of course not perfect, nothing is perfect, but it's an evolving understanding. It will help us to understand those inequalities better, and in so doing, hopefully arrive at better solutions. But I'm sorry, there is no guarantee it will work. So that's
thank you.
only, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Henry, there's a few more questions in the chat, and to everyone in the audience, we have
Okay.
up to 10 minutes if we need.
So then I answer. Okay, Shen Kai, good to see you, my former PhD student. So how can Singapore leverage on the shift towards China plus strategy? Oh, make EDB work harder. And I think Singapore, to be fair to our EDB officers, they do know their game. I mean, otherwise we won't be sitting here, you know. I do think that they have been leveraging on those and diversification out of China and so on and so forth. But I think there are many activities Singapore doesn't want to be involved in. You don't want PC assembly. So semiconductors will be one. For example, if you look at Global Foundries announced new investment, Micron, for example, the US memory company invests so much in Singapore. So these are big happenings that I think we are benefiting from that shift. And because I've interviewed both of them in great detail and very senior people, you must understand that Singapore's semicon role is very useful and significant as risk mitigation to customers. So customers don't want just one fab in Northeast Asia. So Singapore will almost always have the natural advantage of what's called second sourcing. All right. So if you look at our wafer fab, we don't have the most advanced process. I don't think we even have a 10 nanometer or below fab in Singapore. All right. But we have very good business for these fabs, older technology fabs, because of that second sourcing and so on and so forth. All right. Linkage Asia, what kind of leaders will sustain navigating leading? I don't know. It's very difficult to tell. You know, I mean, the current new Intel CEO is very gung ho and really very gung ho. So, but Intel, a few CEOs didn't do quite well, and that's why Intel has fallen behind TSMC and Samsung, which is unbelievable. Even 7-8 years ago, remember, Intel was the dominant firm in the semicon. It's still the largest, by the way, for 30 years. All right, and Intel, as you know, invented the original microprocessor and invented the first memory chip, by the way, in 1970. All right. So Intel is not a small chicken. Is by the way, is called Intel is Intelligence Electronics, short form Intel. All right. That's how Intel was founded by some of the former members of Fairchild Semiconductors. Okay. The rest, okay, Xiaolin, do you consider price buying power have an influence? Very general, this question, very hard to say. I mean, I presume yes, but how exactly it works? I mean, we have to go into specificity, but I mean, we have quite a number of colleagues from our Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. They are distinguished researchers, and I'm sure if you look at their work, you can get better answer, all right? Kishore, thank you very much. Yeah. And James and okay, Disha, related question, inequality, how can you incorporate in this? Okay, so basically what you have heard from me today is the first half of GPN, the black box, right? The happenings of the black box. So what I'm trying to do is that if you want to study, which I forgot to mention earlier, if you want to study worker issue, you want to study development policy issues in specific localities, if you have unpacked the black box as step one, then step two can be done much more effectively. The problem with a lot of existing studies in development studies, regional studies, is that you study many of these activities, gender inequalities on the ground, and then you say it's got to be to do with GPN or GVCs. Now, but the problem is, if you haven't unpacked the black box, you can't really tell that story. So what I'm doing here is only part one. So what your question is about the part two. And of course, now they have unpacked part 1. So hopefully I can do part 2 together, as well as, of course, rely on many of you to carry on the baton as well. Back to James. Oh, Yanis has a question. Okay, then I keep answering. Labor center perspective can help us understand any conversation about shift. A lot of work has been done on this. Supply chain transparency, the audits, and so on and so forth. I don't have unique expertise, but there are a few colleagues in the world who have published quite a lot of material on this. So, but my only argument is that you need to link it back to, partly because when we did the research, we actually asked many of these people, senior executives about, for example, their sourcing of minerals, conflict minerals or not, labor practices. Our postdoc is very interested in labor issues and so on and so forth. So look for their publications. One more, Ray Lin. You also discuss development related to GPI at the city region level. Oh, no, the book doesn't really deal with city regional level, so to speak. I started with the Silicon Valley case study, so to speak, but the book is really about the interconnected worlds of electronics production. Not so much about, if you like, city regional development in relation to this interconnected worlds. And that will be, if you like, the next book. Sorry, those of you know that I have a current book on theory and explanation geography, which is all unbelievable, unreadable social theory stuff. So that will occupy me for a few years before I come back to city regional stuff. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, thank you. But maybe we should let one or two more speak up, James.
Yeah, sure.
Nice to hear some humans.
We have 5 minutes.
Anybody jump in? You just switch on and. George, go ahead.
George, yeah.
Yeah, well, I very much enjoy the presentation, but maybe I can raise a questions coming on from the Chinese audience, because I believe that there's a large audience from China, given the fact that your talk has been widely publicized. Now, looking at this issue from a China point of view, we all understand that China now has opted for a strategy to perhaps go away from what they call external circulation to internal circulation, the 外循环 and 内循环. And I think that there are already experts who have done analysis of this, the ratio between internal and external circulation. So the question that many audience from China may ask is your conception of strategic coupling versus strategic decoupling. So on the assumption that in the years to come, if many of these firms that are connected with the global production networks in China that will experience a shift from external circulation to internal circulation, one of the issues that people may ask is the conception of strategic coupling going to work still in the way that it has been, or from your point of view, is there any theoretical reflection upon, for example, what is going to happen in the years to come, particularly in China?
Thank you, George. Fair question, and the phenomenon is probably quite well known to quite a number of you about internal circulation, or Xi's aim of developing, if you like, domestic consumption. So my short answer would be that the internal circulation argument is more to do with, if you like, economic drivers of GDP growth, which I think my interpretation of internal circulation is more to do with consumption, greater reliance on domestic consumption. The idea of strategic coupling, remember, is more about production. Yeah. So if you think of internal circulation in production, is highly unlikely to be successful, as I mentioned, because if you nationalize the entire production network, it doesn't make sense. And by the way, you can have consumption domestic, but don't you export any of the product that are made? You do. So in that sense, I think internal circulation refers more to the consumption aspect, whereas the production aspect will have to be both internal and external. And strategic coupling applies more to the external, means export oriented, or what I think Neil and I wrote about outside in forms of coupling. Outside in, for example, investment coming in, as well as China going out. By the way, China going out is also a form of strategic coupling of other regions and localities that are plugged into, if you like, China-centric production networks. So I will put it that way. Yeah. Thank you, George. Maybe James, we can pick one or two more. 5:05, we close up then. How about that?
Yeah, I was going to say George, this would be the last question, unless somebody shouts or posts now. I mean, George, it's such a big question. I mean, it's not just a question that people are asking in China, because people are asking this question in different ways elsewhere in Asia and in Europe. And it also is has a certain geopolitical framing now because of the situation in the world. So the question of China's orientation becomes a much bigger question, I think. And GPN is clearly caught up in this. And I think it's very interesting that Henry today started with geopolitics. I've never seen him do that. In all these years, I've never seen him start with geopolitics. And I think this is a moment that we have not seen in Henry's professional lifetime. I think it's a new conjuncture. And the conjuncture may pass. It may not be that important. We need Kishore here, he's gone. It may be that in 6 months' time, we forget about it. And everything is kind of reconfiguring and reworking, but it may not. It's a very uncertain moment. And I think that Henry started with the geopolitical and he ended with it. And your question is also a little bit geopolitical, Prof. Lin, if I may say.
I see a few of our social cultural geography colleagues here. So I really want to see if any
so
of
he's
them
now
has
going
a
to
question
go
for
back
me.
to the cultural geography.
Yeah, you know,
I
like to
he
have
avoids the geopolitics.
Exactly.
He narrowly steps, but no, seriously,
the
Henry,
team
yeah,
or Wei Qiang or whoever, or Eugene, you know, give me something performative.
Well, Henry, I was actually going to ask you a question based on the observation about you talking about geopolitics, which I hadn't expected, but I can understand obviously how it's related. And the question I was going to ask you was, do you see that as a theme at all within the field that you work in? How many, to paraphrase James, how many of people who work in the field of global production networks or the type of economic geography that you do, how many of them would start with geopolitics, and should more of them start with geopolitics?
Okay, let me see how to handle this. Now, to me, the fundamental issue is that geopolitics, as the concept and the term implies, is very big. It's planetary. And if anything goes wrong, if our crazy friend up there press the wrong button today, we'll see mushrooms, right? Everybody, you don't want to see mushroom or mushroom clouds. Yeah. So in that sense, it can be wipe out everything, but it can also be just a scare, right? So it's in that sense that it's not just the context, but also causal. And again, in GPN 2.0, we will have to put it under risk, but it's a risk that used to be calculatable and becoming perhaps less so, becoming uncertainty, if you like, which in turn significantly impact on what firms will do. So if you're an American firm in technology segment, you've got to be very careful. Your technology doesn't go into the blacklists of the Department of Commerce, right? Customers, so to speak. So it makes basically increases everybody's basically information asymmetry, costs of doing business, costs of R&D, customer searching, so on and so forth. So of course, I focus more on, at least economic geographers should focus on more the economic dimension of geopolitical imperative risks and so on and so forth. So it's in that spirit, and that's why I wanted to start it and use those kind of images. And by the way, if you look at the president of the US, I mean, would never really put up a chip. The last time the US was so worried was in the early 1980s when Japan was number one. When 1986, the strategic trade policy was imposed on Japanese semiconductors. And where are those Japanese firms now? All gone except Toshiba, all right? There used to be Mitsubishi, NEC, and what was it? Fujitsu, and Hitachi. These used to be the top 5 biggest semiconductor firms in the 1980s. And they all merged, gone, small player now. Yeah, so in that sense, if you were to say, maybe if you look at the Japanese outcome, you will say it has something to do with US geopolitical imperative in this time. And
Henry,
hence subsequently the Plaza Accord,
Henry, do people talk about geoeconomics?
You mean in GPN kind of work?
Yeah, has it, because it's such a big literature.
More geopolitical economy, I think.
Yeah.
In that sense, I think Jim Glassman pushes the angle as well,
That's a kind of like history of developmental states and Cold War development and Korean firms.
That one is very, very big in political science. If you go back to the 2016 Cornell book I pull out all that literature, enormously important. Samsung wouldn't be what it is, one may argue, if it's not due to the original geopolitical concern. And of course, the support that Park Chung-hee, the strongman, got from the US in his time. So it's in that sense. Okay, looks like we should let our, I mean, we have, I think I have one friend who is infected and yet stay tuned. So thank you for attending today's seminar.
So do people want to stay tuned? Because I'm going to have to leave. If I leave,
I can hang around for another 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, if people want to stay tuned and just chat informally.
Otherwise, feel free to go,
I think we declare an end to the seminar and we formally thank Henry. So let us do that. Thank you very much, Henry. And we thank our audience and for the questions. If people want to stay and chat informally just for a few minutes, I think a few of you may do that. I have to go.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Thank you.
It was really good.
Thank you, everybody.
So and thank you, everyone.
And,
thanks for the
questions.
questions.
Feel free to log off.
And good to see colleagues in so many